They said she would lose the farm before winter. That was 7 years ago. This morning, 3 trucks were waiting at her gate. Peshastin, Washington, May. First real warm morning of the year. The gravel road that runs east of Highway 2 curves twice before it ends at the gate of the Ashwood Orchard, and by 7 that morning, 3 trucks were already lined along the shoulder waiting. A silver Toyota Tacoma with a Portland restaurant magnet on the door, a white Ford F-250 with Yakima County plates and a distillery decal, a blue Chevy stepside that had come from farther east than either. Their engines idled in the cool. Steam rose from 3 coffee cups on 3 dashboards. The road did not usually see this kind of traffic. Across the fence, apple trees stood in their May finish, blossoms fading to leaf, leaves catching the light in that first light way that makes an orchard look almost fluorescent from the road. Beyond the orchard on the sloping 12-acre lot, the county tax map still called Section 4, a young stand of grafted rootstocks marched in neat rows down to the creek. The soil there was dark. Where a stranger's boot would sink it sank. Where it sank worms moved. The porch door opened. A woman stepped out. She was small frame 31 that spring, auburn hair pinned back with what a stranger might have taken for a wooden clip, but which was on closer inspection a Norwegian grafting clip her grandfather's grandfather had brought over from Bergen. Her jeans were faded at the knees. A leather-bound journal rested against her hip inside the deep pocket of her chore coat. On her belt, half hidden behind the strap, sat a small copper knife with a walnut handle. She held a clipboard. The man in the Portland Tacoma tipped his cap and asked, before he had even shut his door, how many gallons she had left. Not whether she had any, not what she was selling, only how many. She glanced at her list. 12. She could give him 12. He nodded, closed the door, drove around back the way she pointed. The white Ford pulled up next, and she made a small mark on her clipboard beside a name she had known for 4 years. Behind him, the blue Chevy started to roll forward and then stopped again because a 4th vehicle had appeared at the head of the road. It was not a truck. It was a silver Ford Expedition. Its windows were tinted. Its tires had recently seen more highway than gravel. The Expedition did not stop. It drove past the gate slowly, the way a person drives past a house. He is deciding whether to buy, and continued on toward the Cascade Fruit Company's Wenatchee plant 12 miles east. Hazel Ashwood watched it go. She did not smile. She did not turn her head. Her right hand rested lightly on the top rail of the fence, and her thumb ran once habit private across the walnut of the knife handle. 7 years earlier, on a gravel road just outside this town, 3 different men had told her the same thing. They had not conferred. They had not needed to. Each had said in his own way that this land would be gone by winter, and that a young woman on her own could not carry a place like this. One of them had said it aloud in the coffee shop over pancakes. Another had said it to her face at the mailbox, tapping his cap for punctuation. The third had said it in his own barn to another farmer who had told her about it later. None of them had said it this year. None of them, in fact, had said much of anything for a while now. The morning Ansel Ashwood died was cold enough for breath. It was the 2nd Tuesday of March, in the year Hazel was 24, and the pruning weather had been bad all week. Wet snow on Sunday, hard frost overnight into Monday, a wind that came down out of the Cascades from the northwest and got into a person's ribs the way a bad cough gets into a house. Ansel had gone out anyway. He had a wine sap in row 8 that needed shaping. He had said so at breakfast. He had said when Hazel had asked whether it could wait a day that it could not. Wendell Crane found him at 4. Wendell had driven over to bring back a length of galvanized pipe he had borrowed the summer before. He had not called first. He had let himself in through the western gate, because that was how a neighbor of 31 years came onto a farm, and when he had crossed the yard toward the orchard, he had seen the boots. Ansel was on his back in the winesap row. His right hand was still around the copper knife. His hat had rolled about 6 feet down the wet grass. Wendell did not go closer than he needed to. He looked. He walked to his truck. He drove to Hazel's tour company office in Kashmir and told her in the parking lot with his cap in his hand. She drove back with him. She did not remember the drive. The next thing she remembered clearly was standing in her grandfather's kitchen at 9 that night with the copper knife on the table in front of her. It had been cleaned. Wendell had cleaned it before he had left. He had not asked her permission. He had known better than she did what needed to happen. The knife lay on the pine boards of the kitchen table with its walnut handle catching the yellow light. She sat down across from it. She did not touch it. Aunt Ruth Ann came in from the porch. Aunt Ruth Ann put water in the kettle. That was all either of them said or did for about an hour. The funeral was small. The Norwegian Lutheran Church on Cottage Avenue in Peshastin had been Ansel's church since 1953, when his father had brought him there in a wool coat 2 sizes too large, and Reverend Halvorson, the current one whose father had also been a Halvorson, did the service on Saturday morning. 40 people came. Hazel wore her mother's black dress, which she had not worn since her own parents' funeral in 2009, and which fit differently now. Aunt Ruth Ann wore navy. Wendell Crane wore a suit that had last been out of its garment bag for his own wife's funeral 11 years earlier, and he sat 3 rows behind Hazel and did not sing. The reception was in the church basement. Ham sandwiches, coffee, a pan of egg salad someone's aunt had made. Hazel stood by the coffee urn for most of it and answered the same question in 6 different ways from 6 different neighbors. She said she did not know. She said she had not decided. She said Cascade had not made her an offer yet. She said that last part twice to 2 different people and would remember later that both of them had looked away when she said it. The will was read on Monday morning in the office of a lawyer named Randstad on 2nd Street in Wenatchee. 60 acres, the farmhouse, Ansel's leather-bound journal, 1968 to the previous May, his copper apple grafting knife, $6,400 in a checking account at Peshastin Community Bank, an outstanding equipment loan at First Cascade National of $18,000 transferred to Hazel upon acceptance, a contract with the Cascade Fruit Company signed October 1998 for agricultural waste disposal on Section 4, $2,400 annually, automatic 20-year renewal, no early termination clause. Hazel signed 6 pages. Aunt Ruth Ann signed as witness. Randstad signed as counsel. They walked out into the gray March light of 2nd Street and did not talk about the numbers on the way home. 2 weeks later, the first truck came. It was a Tuesday. It was 9:17 in the morning. Hazel was at the kitchen sink washing a coffee cup, and she heard the air brakes at the gate before she saw the truck. She dried her hands. She walked out onto the porch. What she saw at first, she did not understand. A flatbed, tarp over the load, a short man in a Carhartt coat standing by the driver's door with a clipboard. He raised a hand at her, not a wave, an acknowledgement. She walked down the gravel drive. "You, Miss Ashwood," not a question. "I am. I've got 8 tons for Section 4. Where you want it. Hazel stopped about 4 feet from him. She looked at the truck. She looked at his clipboard. She looked back at him. Section 4 of what she said. He did not laugh. He turned the clipboard so she could read the top sheet. It was a delivery manifest for Cascade Fruit Company, Ellensburg Processing Plant. First drop of the season. Recipient Ashwood Orchard Contract File 98C4. That land there, the man said, and pointed with his chin toward the 12 acres at the western end of her property where the creek ran, where when Hazel had been a child, she had once found a red garter snake in the ferns. What's in the load? Pomace. What's pomace? The man looked at her a moment, not unkindly. He shifted his weight to his other boot. It's what's left after we press the apples, he said. Skins, cores, the mash. We got a contract with the property. 22 years running. Not with me. With the property, ma'am. Owner don't matter. Contract runs with the land. She stood there. She did not know at that point how much she did not know. She would find out later, and Randstad would explain it to her by telephone in a voice that was carefully sympathetic and carefully impersonal, that yes, the covenant was recorded against the deed, that it had been legally executed by her grandfather, that its consideration had been paid, and that its transfer with title was unfortunately absolutely lawful. The man was waiting. Dump it, she said, not because she had accepted anything, because the sentence needed to end. He nodded. He climbed back into the cab. The truck rolled slowly down the gravel and into Section 4, where he backed up carefully so as not to tip the load, and where he raised the bed slowly and let 8 tons of dark brown mash slide down onto the ground with a wet, heavy sound Hazel had never heard before and would recognize from that morning forward from 100 yards away. She was still standing in the drive when the second vehicle came. It was a silver Ford Expedition. It came slowly. It stopped just past the mailbox, and a man in his early 50s climbed out, adjusting the cuff of a barn coat that had been chosen more for its cut than its use. He was tall, silver at the temples, clean shave. He walked up to her the way a man walks up to a room he already assumes is his own, and when he reached her, he offered a hand that had not held a wrench that morning. Von Merrick, he said, Cascade Fruit. She did not take his hand. He did not seem to mind. He looked out over the orchard, then back at her, and the smile that arranged itself across his face had the precision of a well-set post. Your grandfather was a good man, he said. I always liked Ansel. Hazel said nothing. I hate to see a young woman try to carry a place like this alone. His voice was pitched to the exact frequency of a fatherly concern that had never once in its life been actually fatherly. I'd like to help you out of a hard situation if you'll let me. He named a number, 340,000. He named it as though he were quoting the price of grain at a co-op board. Hazel had done the math already in Randstad's office. She had done it again on the back of a feed receipt at the kitchen table on Sunday. Her grandfather's land, valued honestly and with an eye to comparables in the valley, was worth somewhere north of 580,000 and would climb. No, she said. The smile did not change, only the eyes. They cooled a quarter of a degree, and she saw the cooling. You just think about it, he said. Winter's coming. He turned. He walked back to the SUV. He drove away in the same soft crunch of gravel with which he had come, and she stood in the drive with her hands at her sides and watched him until the tail lights had rounded the bend past Wendell Crane's fence line. Then she walked slowly down towards Section 4, where 8 tons of brown mash lay in the sun that was just now finally warming. Hazel had been 9 the first time Ansel had shown her the knife. She could not recall the exact date, only that it had been October, one of those October afternoons in the Wenatchee Valley, when the light does something to the ridge that a photograph cannot hold, and that she had been wearing the red plaid coat she had inherited from a cousin in Kashmir. The apples had been in. Ansel had been working the north row where he kept the older varieties, Cortland, Winesap, 2 northern spies he had grafted himself from a scion his father had carried from the old country in 1907 and had passed to him in 1968. That was the way Ansel talked. Everything belonged to someone. He had knelt beside a young rootstock. He had taken the copper knife from his belt. Hazel had known the knife by then, the way a child knows the way her mother's hand looks, not by studying it, by having always seen it. She had known that the handle was walnut. She had known that Ansel oiled it every winter with a bit of linseed on a rag. She had not known on that October afternoon that it had crossed an ocean. I told her that day. He told her the story short. Her great-great-grandfather, Ole Ashwood, had left Bergen in the spring of 1907. He had come across on a Norwegian-American line steamer with a canvas bag, a coat, and wrapped in an oiled cloth in the bag, the knife. He had come first to Minnesota. He had come from Minnesota to Peshastin in 1919 because he had heard incorrectly at the time and correctly later that apples grew well here. He grafted his first tree in this soil in 1920, Ansel had said. His voice had been low and careful, the way voices are when they mean the words. The tree died. He grafted another. That one lived. It stood right where the Cortland row starts now. It is not there anymore, but the line is. Hazel had asked him what he meant by the line. Every apple on that Cortland row, Ansel had said, shares wood with every apple that came out of his hands. Same rootstock family, same scions cut from the same trees. It never stopped. It only kept going. He had turned then. He had held up the knife between them. Its blade had caught the October light. A grafting knife does not cut, he had said. It teaches 2 things to be one. Hazel had not understood the sentence at 9 years old. She had understood something else. She had understood that her grandfather had never in her presence said a sentence like that about anything, and that if he was saying it now, it was because he thought she was old enough to keep it. She had nodded. She had not said thank you. He would not have wanted her to. I had then done what she had come out to watch him do. He had made a clean angled cut into the rootstock. He had made a matching angled cut on a scion he had taken from a winesap that morning. He had fit them together. He had wrapped them tight in grafting tape. He had said, "That's it. Now we wait." Hazel had wanted to know how long. He had said, "Longer than you think. That's the whole trick." That night, back in the kitchen, he had put the knife back in its wooden cigar box on the top shelf of the pantry where he kept the things he did not want anyone but him to move. She had not seen the knife again for 15 years. Now she sat at the kitchen table on the second Tuesday of April, and the wooden cigar box was open in front of her, and inside the box lay the knife and the leather-bound journal that had lived beside it. She had not opened the pantry since Ansel had died. She had not been able to. Aunt Ruth Ann, 10 days after the funeral, had taken the box down for her and set it on the kitchen table without a word, and had walked out to the porch with her coffee, and had not come back in until Hazel had called her name. Hazel had opened the box then. She had opened it and closed it 4 times before she had opened it and left it open. She lifted the journal now. Its leather was soft at the edges from decades of being carried in a coat pocket. Its cover had a small scar just below the top right corner where Ansel had once dropped it in a spring puddle in 1974. The first page bore in a much younger hand than she was used to a single line dated April 12, 1968. Planted the North Row today. Rain. She turned pages. Weather entries. Grafting dates. Variety names. Yield figures. A brief mention in October 1972 of the price of wine sap at auction. A single line in July 1979. Marta is pregnant. This is the best year. A page in 2003 with no words, only a small drawing in ballpoint of a maple leaf. That was Marta's death. Hazel knew it without having to be told. She turned. She turned. She had reached 2015 when she heard the air brakes at the gate. She got up. She did not walk to the porch. She walked instead out through the back door and across the gravel and up the low rise towards Section 4, where the flatbed was already easing into position. It was Wednesday. Cascade came Wednesdays too. She had learned in 7 days what the schedule was. She had learned it the way a person learns the sound of a neighbor's dog barking through a wall. The driver did not see her at first. He was backing up. She stopped 40 feet away and stood in the tall grass and watched him raise the bed. She watched the second load of that week fall onto the pile of the first. 9 tons. She had asked the first driver. She had gotten the number for Tuesday, 9 on Wednesday, sometimes 6 on Friday, between 40 and 60 tons a week during the pressing season, less in winter. The load slid down. The driver got out. He wiped his hands. He saw her. He raised his cap. Miss Ashwood. Same time next week. Yes, ma'am. He climbed back in. He drove out. She stayed in the grass with her hands in the pockets of her chore coat until his diesel had gone quiet down the road. Then she walked back to the kitchen. She sat down at the table again. She picked up the journal. She turned to the last 3 pages, and she read what her grandfather had written in the last weeks of his life on the subject of what was happening on Section 4. The first entry in the last 3 pages was dated April 11th, 2015. Ansel had written it in the small, careful hand he used when he wanted to remember exactly. Section 4, boundary sample, northeast corner, 3-inch depth, pH 4.1, 2.7% organic matter, arsenic elevated method, not verified. Send to WSU lab. That was the whole entry. The next one was July. Sample received. Lab confirms arsenic at 1.8 times regional baseline. Following his name at the bottom of the entry, he had written in slightly darker ink, as though he had come back and added it later. Cascade began dumping this section. 1998. Hazel read that line twice. Then she read the whole 3 pages through. There were 16 entries in total. They spanned 4.5 years. April 2015 to the middle of May 2019, 3 weeks before he had died. He had taken 16 soil samples. He had recorded the pH, the organic matter, the arsenic and the cadmium, and the mercury readings. He had noted twice that the creek downstream of Section 4 showed elevated bacterial counts in spring melt. He had photocopied Cascade's WSDA disposal permits. He had them somewhere. The copies were not in the journal, and he had written in June of 2018 that the permits did not, in his reading of them, cover Pomas. The last entry in the journal was undated. It was a letter. It ran a page and a quarter. It was addressed to the director of the Solid Waste Management Program, Washington Department of Ecology, Central Region Office in Yakima. Ansel had drafted it in pencil. He had crossed out one sentence in the middle of the second paragraph and rewritten it in the margin. He had not signed it. It ended mid-sentence. The last words on the page were, "And I have watched them," and then a small dash, and then nothing. Hazel closed the journal. She put both hands flat on the wood of the kitchen table. She looked at them. Her right thumbnail was chipped from a wire she had tightened on the chicken coop the day before yesterday. Her left hand had a small burn along the base of the thumb from the cast iron. She was 24 years old. Her grandfather had left her a fight he had not yet started, and he had left it to her in 3 pages of a leather-bound book without asking her whether she wanted it and without offering an apology for not asking. She sat with that for a long time. Then she got up. She washed her face at the kitchen sink. She poured a cup of coffee she did not drink, and she walked back to the table, and she took a piece of paper from the drawer where Ansel kept the receipts from the feed store, and she began to write down what she needed to know. She wrote POMACE, what it is. She wrote contract, whether it can be broken. She wrote Washington Department of Ecology, whom to call. She wrote soil, what it takes to fix. She wrote myself, what I know how to do. She underlined the last line twice. Then Wendell Crane drove up. Hazel saw him from the kitchen window. His truck was the pale blue Ford he had driven for as long as she could remember. It came slowly up the gravel. It stopped at the fence. He did not honk. He did not get out. He rolled his window down and waited. She put on her coat. She went out. She walked to his window with her hands in her pockets. He nodded at her once, and he waited for her to speak first, because Wendell Crane had never in his life started a conversation, though he had ended 100. Wendell, Miss Ashwood, you can call me Hazel. He did not answer that. He looked out through his windshield at Section 4, which he could see the corner of from where they were standing. His eyes were the flat gray of a man who has considered a lot of things in his life and has decided most of them. You need to know, he said, that Cascade is going to break you if you don't sell to them. She did not answer. You need to know, he said again, that your granddad thought about selling too more than once, and that the reason he didn't wasn't that he was proud. Then what was it? Wendell looked at her. His face did not change. His mouth had a small tightness at the corner that she was not sure she was reading correctly. He said once, at a coffee counter in Kashmir, Wendell said that a man who signs a contract like that is not signing a contract. He's signing an inheritance. I didn't understand him then. I've thought about it some since. She waited. He did not say more. I tipped his cap, the small distance that farmers tip caps for private things, and he shifted the truck into gear, and he drove away without offering advice and without offering help. And Hazel stood in the drive with her hands still in her pockets and watched his tail lights disappear. She had not, she realized, standing there, asked him what he had meant. She had not asked because she had already begun to know. That night, she called Washington State University Extension, the Wenatchee office. A woman named Marla answered. Hazel introduced herself. She said her grandfather's name. There was a small silence on the line, and then Marla said, I remember him. I'm sorry. What can I do? Hazel said she had a soil problem. She said she had inherited a piece of land that had been receiving industrial waste for a long time. She said she wanted to know what could be done. Marla Listen without interrupting. When Hazel had finished, Marla said, I want to give you Otis Colburn's phone number. He is retired. He does not answer the office anymore, but he will answer you if you call. Tell him I gave it to you. Hazel wrote the number on the back of the same receipt she had made her list on. She did not call that night. She called at 11 the next morning, sitting at her kitchen table with the receipt in one hand and the phone in the other, and a man answered on the second ring, and his voice was gravelly and slow, and he said, This is Otis. My name is Hazel Ashwood, Hazel said. Marla at Extension gave me your number. Ashwood. Yes, sir. Related to Ansel, his granddaughter. There was a long silence on the line. I am very sorry, Otis said. I did not know he had passed. Nobody told me. I should have known. It's all right. It's not. She waited. What do you have? He said finally. Tell me. She told him. She told him about Section 4. She told him about the pomace. She told him about the 16 soil samples and the unfinished letter and the fact that Cascade had come every Tuesday and every Wednesday and sometimes every Friday for 22 years, and that the ground under her boots had turned into something that was not any more ground in the usual sense. Otis let her finish. Then he said, You are not going to fix this in a year. Do you understand that? Yes, sir. You are going to spend money before you make money. Do you understand that? Yes, sir. Composting first. That is what I would try. Windrows. Straw for carbon. You are going to fail the first 2 or 3 times. Do you understand that? Hazel closed her eyes. Yes, sir. All right, Otis said. Then we can talk. By the last week of May, Hazel had the windrow built. She had spent the 7 weeks between the first Cascade delivery and the day she started the pile learning things she had never in her life expected to need to know. She had learned that the carbon to nitrogen ratio of apple pomace was according to a paper she had found at the Wenatchee Library in the neighborhood of 65 to 1, and that a compost pile needed to sit closer to 30. She had learned that pomace was at 19.5% solids wetter than compost wanted. She had learned that pile height mattered, that pile shape mattered, that the presence of a bulking agent, straw, sawdust, wood chips mattered enormously, and that all of this had been known and written down and available for the reading for the better part of a century, and that no one at Cascade had ever, in 22 years, come to the door of the man they had been dumping on to explain any of it. She had rented a small tractor from Fitchmeyer's Equipment in Kashmir for 2 days. She had paid $240 for straw from a hay lot outside of Ellensburg. She had rented a windrow turner for another $400. She had hauled pomace across Section 4 from the main dump pile using the tractor's small bucket in 11 separate loads over the course of a Saturday. She had built the pile 25 yards behind the barn. She had built it per Otis's instructions on the phone in a shape close to a long, low loaf, 6 feet at the crest, 12 feet long, 4 feet wide at the base. She had layered pomace and straw in alternating 6-inch bands. She had watered each layer to the point of dampness without saturation. She had on the 3rd day run the turner through it, and the pile had steamed like a horse in the cold, and the temperature probe she had pushed into the middle of it that evening had read 132 degrees. Otis, on the phone, had said, "That's the sound of it working." He had said also, "Now don't stop turning." She had turned it every 3 days. On the 7th day, the temperature had read 145. On the 9th day, 158. Hazel had begun to feel in a way she had not felt about anything since her grandfather had died, that something was going to be all right. That evening she had walked out to the pile with a coffee cup at 7 and had heard the rats. She had not seen them at first. She had only heard the small, dry rustling of a body moving through straw. She had swung her flashlight up. The beam had caught a brown flank the size of her forearm at the edge of the pile. It had not run. It had looked at her. It had unhurriedly gone back to its business. She had counted 5 distinct rustles. She had not slept well that night. On the 10th day, the temperature had read 165. On the 11th, 141. On the 12th, 98. On the 13th, 72, which was the same as the outdoor air, and by then the smell had come on so hard she could pick it up from the porch at the house. It was not a rotting food smell. It was closer to the smell of a bad wine cellar and paint thinner and something dead that had been left in warm water. It came in waves. It hung over the yard when the wind was still. The Cortland row nearest to the pile had a small brown ring in its lower leaves. Within 4 days that Hazel did not initially connect to the pile and later understood she should have. She turned the pile on day 14. The turner's blades hit anaerobic pockets that had gone slick and gray inside, and the smell got worse. On day 15, Wendell Crane drove past on his way into town. He did not stop. He slowed. He shook his head very slowly in a way that seemed to Hazel more sad than triumphant, and he drove on. She stood at the fence and watched him go. She did not cry. She did not at that point have the room in her chest for it. She went in. She called Otis. She told him what she was reading on the probe. He was silent for a moment on the line, and then he said, "It went anaerobic." Something choked out the airflow. Could be the pomace was still too wet. Could be your straw wasn't broken up. Could be the pile settled too fast. So, what do? You tear it apart. You compost the good half. You spread the bad half thin somewhere it can't hurt anything, and you let it dry. And you take notes on what happened, so it does not happen again. How much did I lose? Otis was quiet again. Money, he said carefully. You lost 800, give or take. Time, you lost 3 weeks. Learning, you lost nothing. I don't feel like I've learned anything. You have, Otis said. You just don't know what yet. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table with the receipt list in front of her: pomace, contract, ecology, soil, myself. And she looked at the last line, myself, and she added a word after it in pencil: what I know. She looked at that. She crossed it out. She wrote instead what I can learn. She did not underline it. She went outside. She walked down to the pile. The evening was cool. The rats had gone quiet. A fly rose from the pile and drifted past her face. She stood there for a long minute with her hands in her chore coat pockets and the copper knife tapping lightly against her hip when she shifted her weight, and she looked at the pile the way a person looks at a first draft that has failed all the way through. She stayed until dark. Then she went in. Aunt Ruth Ann was at the kitchen table when Hazel came through the door. Ruth Ann had let herself in with her key. There was a plate on the table with a slice of cornbread on it and a small dish of butter next to the plate. There was coffee in the pot. Ruth Ann did not look up when Hazel came in. She was reading a page of the journal that Hazel had left open on the table that morning. He never said any of this to me, Ruth Ann said. She did not raise her voice, not one word of it. 22 years. Hazel took off her coat. She hung it on the hook by the door. He was ashamed, Ruth Ann said. It was not a question. She turned the page slowly. She read to herself. She turned another. She read that one. Then she closed the journal and rested one hand on its cover. Well, she said, sit down. Eat the cornbread. Hazel sat. She ate. She did not taste any of it. Ruth Ann, when Hazel finished, poured her a coffee and set it in front of her. Ruth Ann then sat back and folded her hands in her lap and looked at her niece across the table for a long moment in the kitchen whose yellow bulb Hazel had been meaning to change for 2 weeks now. You will not be alone in this, Ruth Ann said. I want you to hear me say it once. Then I will not say it again. Hazel looked up. You will not be alone in this. Hazel nodded. Ruth Ann nodded too. She got up. She washed the plate. She hung the dish towel over the handle. She said good night and she let herself out through the back door, and the porch boards creaked under her step, and Hazel heard the door of Ruth Ann's little Subaru open and close and start. Then she was alone again in the kitchen. She sat with the coffee for a while. Then she got up and she walked out to the porch, and she stood in the dark and looked at the fir trees on the ridge black against a sky that was still not fully dark. And she said aloud to the copper knife at her hip and to no one else the sentence her grandfather had said to her once when she was 9. She said it. She heard herself say it. Then she said it again. She went inside. The night the first pile failed, she went to bed at 10 and did not sleep. She lay on her back on the mattress in the room that had been hers since she was 7, the room with the small window that looked out on the north row of the orchard, the room where her grandmother's watercolor of a Norwegian church still hung above the dresser, and she thought about the numbers, the $800 she had spent, the 3 weeks she had lost, the 8 tons of pomace that had come into Section 4 on Tuesday, the 9 tons that had come in on Wednesday, the next Tuesday coming, the next Wednesday, the 40 to 60 tons every week, and the winter she had not yet spent on this farm, and the 18,000 at First Cascade National. She thought about Von Merrick's smile. She thought about Wendell Crane's headshake in her rearview mirror. She thought about her grandfather kneeling in the wine sap row with a copper knife in his hand and his hat rolling down the wet grass 6 feet away. At 2 in the morning she got up. She put on her coat over her pajamas. She put on her boots. She walked out through the back door and across the gravel and up the low rise to Section 4, where the pomace pile lay in the dark, like something the ridge had left behind. The moon was 3/4 and clear. The fir trees on the ridge were black. The Wenatchee River far off was a sound she could not hear so much as feel. She sat down on the ground at the edge of the pile. She took the journal out of her coat pocket. She did not open it. She could not have read it in that light anyway. She only held it flat against her thigh, and she rested the palm of her other hand on the walnut of the copper knife at her belt. She thought for the first time since March that her grandfather had left her a chance, not a plan, not a solution, not a fix, a chance. Ein had, in his last 3 years and in his last 3 pages, done a thing she had not understood the size of until that night. He had documented. He had waited. He had known, apparently, that he was not going to be the one to finish. He had known this the way a farmer knows a season without being told, and he had left the shape of a fight to a granddaughter he had raised half of, and he had done it without asking, and he had done it because he had thought, for reasons she was going to have to trust before she understood, that she was the one who could carry it. She stayed at the edge of the pile until 3:30. Then she stood up. She brushed the dew off her coat. She walked back to the farmhouse in the dark past the leaning corner of the barn her great-great-grandfather had built in 1922, past the porch her grandfather had painted the summer she was 12, past the window of her grandmother's kitchen that still held its yellow bulb, and she climbed the porch steps. She stopped at the door. She turned. She looked back at Section 4 in the moonlight one more time. Then she said quietly, so that no one heard her, "A grafting knife does not cut. It teaches two things to be one." She went inside. 2 years is a shape. It is not always a shape a person sees while they are inside it, but it is a shape all the same. 2 years is what it takes for a compost pile that has failed once to be understood well enough to build a second one that does not. 2 years is what it takes to look at a windrow and know from the color and the density of the steam whether the interior temperature is somewhere in the 60s or somewhere in the low hundreds. 2 years is what it takes for a woman who has never turned a pile before to know without measuring that she has laid a bulking agent 1 inch too thick. Hazel had spent those 2 years. She had spent them in 20 different ways, and she had a notebook in her coat pocket, now a spiral one, cheap, with a red cardboard cover that contained in penciled dates and small columns of numbers everything she had learned in each of them: compost ratios, temperature curves, what Otis had said on the second Tuesday of every month when he called from Wenatchee to ask how the pile was doing, what she had said back, what she had gotten wrong, what she had eventually gotten right. The main dump on Section 4 had grown. It had, in fact, doubled. Cascade had come every Tuesday and every Wednesday and sometimes every Friday for the 2 years since Ansell's death, and had increased its Friday deliveries in the fall to accommodate the pressing season, and the pile at the west end of Section 4 had become a small dark hill visible from Wendell Crane's yard across the road. It had in warm months carried a haze of flies that on still evenings could be seen from a quarter-mile off. Vaughn Merrick had not visited in 14 months. He had raised his offer once by letter, 398,000, a number chosen precisely for its psychological gravity, and had received no reply. He had not lowered the offer since. He had not raised it either. He was, Hazel understood clearly by then, waiting. She was learning to wait too. The half-acre strip at the north edge of Section 4 was another matter. That strip had received over 18 months the finished compost from the second and third and fourth windrows Hazel had built, each of them small, each of them narrower than the failure, each of them shaped by what the failure had taught. The strip's grass had come in that spring for the first time in what Wendell Crane, driving past one May afternoon, said might have been 30 years. He had said this without stopping. He had said it out of his open window at a volume Hazel could hear from her porch, and then he had raised his hand and kept going. Otis Colburn came in person for the first time on a Thursday in early June. He drove up from Wenatchee in an old white Toyota pickup with a lumber rack. He was 71 that year. He walked with a slight limp on his left side from an old knee, and he wore a gray canvas vest over a checked flannel shirt, and he stood at Hazel's gate with his cap in his hand for a full minute before she came out because he had wanted, he told her later, to look at the orchard from the road first. "Miss Ashwood, you can call me Hazel, Mr. Colburn. You can call me Otis." She led him out through the yard. They walked slowly. Otis stopped at the north end of the compost strip and knelt down. He pushed his finger into the ground. He turned up a small piece of what had been 6 months earlier apple pomace and was now something else. Dark, crumbly, alive. He held it against his palm. He did not speak. He knelt there for what felt to Hazel like a long time, and when he stood up again, he did so with the slow care of a man who has learned in his 60s that standing up quickly was a mistake. You've been at this 2 years, 2 years and change. How much have you spread? Half acre, along the north edge here. Otis looked at the strip. He looked out at the main dump pile at the far end of Section 4. He did the arithmetic in his head that Hazel had done 100 times, which was that at her current rate of composting, she was processing about 12 tons of pomace a month, and that Cascade was bringing her somewhere between 40 and 60 tons a week, and that she was in the plainest terms falling behind by roughly 200 tons a year, and that this gap was going to grow before it shrank. He did not say any of that, neither did she. They both knew. He said instead, "Your grandfather kept a mother culture in the pantry." She looked at him. "He used it for salad dressings. He gave me a jar in 2011. I still have it." Hazel stood there in her boots at the edge of the half acre, and she felt something in her chest do a small, quiet thing she did not have a name for. "What are you telling me, Otis?" "I am telling you," Otis said, "that apples know how to become vinegar. They have known it for as long as there have been apples, and that vinegar, if it is any good, sells for $1 an ounce in the right bottle, and that a woman with 60 tons of pomace to work with each week is a woman who is, whether she knows it yet or not, sitting on a considerable amount of vinegar." Hazel said nothing. Otis looked out across Section 4. "I am also telling you," he said, "that you cannot compost your way out of this in your lifetime. You need something faster, and you need something that pays." She turned her head. Wendell Crane's blue Ford was on the road. It slowed. It did not stop. Wendell raised one finger from the top of the steering wheel, which Hazel had learned in 2 years to read as a greeting he did not give to strangers. Otis raised his own hand back. Wendell drove on. "He'll come by later," Hazel said. "He usually does when someone new is here." "I know," Wendell Otis said. "He was on my extension district in the 80s. Was he a friend?" Otis considered this a long moment. "He was a stubborn man," he said finally. "He is still a stubborn man. That is the same thing as being a friend in this country, if you know how to read it." They walked on. Otis showed her at the fence line where the creek ran down out of the ridge how a person might set up a small pilot fermentation. 200 gallons to start, stainless steel, a mother culture built from Ansel's old jar. Acetobacter did the work if the temperature stayed in the high 60s, and if the mash was aerated slightly, and if a person could keep the pH inside a narrow window from the second week until the 12th. He would help her sketch the layout. He knew a man in Wenatchee who was selling used dairy equipment cheap. He gave her the man's number on a piece of paper. Wendell Crane drove by again on the way back from town at 4. This time he stopped. He rolled his window down and did not get out. His eyes flicked to Otis, then to Hazel, then back to Otis. "Otis Colburn, Wendell, you out here to fix her ground for her. I'm out here to keep her from breaking it worse than it is." Wendell nodded once. He looked at Hazel. "You know rats will come. Already have." Wendell's mouth tightened at one corner, in that way she had learned to read, and he did not smile, but he did tap the door frame twice with the flat of his hand, and he shifted into gear. "Well," he said, and drove on. Otis watched him go. "He'll be back," Otis said. "Wendell is a slow river, but he's not a stagnant one." Hazel walked Otis to his truck at dusk. She thanked him. He shook his head as if the thanks were not necessary, and might in fact have been unwelcome. He said before he closed the door, "You will want to move the mother culture out of the pantry. It's too warm in there in the summer. Put it in the barn near where you'll be brewing. It likes to be close to its work." She nodded. She stood in the drive until his tail lights disappeared past the Cortland row. She went into the pantry that night. She took down the cigar box. She did not open it. She carried it out to the barn, set it on the workbench near the empty space where the new fermenters would sit, and left it there for the night. It seemed to her in the yellow bulb light of the barn that the box belonged there in a way it had not quite belonged in the pantry. The knife she thought was already at work. She just had not yet seen what it was making. By January of the following year, the fermenters were in. She had bought 4 of them from the man in Wenatchee for $180 apiece, stainless steel, 250-gallon capacity. The dairy that had originally used them had gone under in 2018. The man threw in 8 feet of stainless piping and 2 spare valves because he said he did not want to look at them anymore. She had set them up along the western wall of the old barn where the sun did not reach, and the temperature stayed a few degrees cooler than the yard, and this had seemed in late November when she had installed them to be an advantage. Vinegar did not want heat. Vinegar wanted steady. Steady, she had thought, was what an unheated barn in Peshastin gave you. She had been wrong about that. She had learned over a slow cold spell in the second week of January that the fermenters, being metal, being uninsulated, being pushed against a wall that was itself uninsulated, followed the ambient air temperature down about 6 hours behind it. The mother culture Otis had helped her cultivate from Ansel's jar had bloomed beautifully through November and December. It had made vinegar, real vinegar, deep amber, tart, clean, the kind of smell that made a person's mouth pull sideways in a good way when they leaned over the barrel. And then the fermenters had dropped to 58 degrees. Then by the last week of January to 55. She had not known at that point quite how quickly Acetobacter went to sleep. She had known it wanted warmth. She had assumed warmth meant 60. It did not. It meant 68 to 77, and it meant 68 to 77 consistently, and it meant that a temperature swing of 12 degrees over 3 days was a form of small, quiet violence being done to a biological process that could not defend itself. The calm yeast came first. It appeared as a thin white film on the surface of the largest fermenter on the 23rd of January. Hazel had not known what it was. She had called Otis. Otis had said, "That's calm. That's what shows up when the Acetobacter can't do its job. It's not going to kill you, but it is going to ruin the batch." Ruin it how? It's going to taste like nail polish remover. Wait, you'll see. She had waited. 2 days later, she had opened the fermenter to test it, and the smell that came up had in fact been the smell of nail polish remover, and behind it, something worse, something that came from ethyl acetate and something that came from acetaldehyde. And Hazel had closed the lid and stood in the middle of the barn with her hand over her mouth for a full minute without moving. She had lost the batch. She had lost the next one 2 weeks later from the same cause because she had not yet installed the small heater she had ordered and which had, because of a shipping error, been sent to Wenatchee first and then to Ellensburg and then finally to her back porch in 3 separate boxes over a period of 14 days. She had lost the 3rd batch in early March when the barn had finally warmed enough to hold 60 degrees but not 65, and the acetobacter had begun to work again, but too slowly, and the pH had stalled at 4.2. Otis had told her the target was under 4.0. The batch had gone flabby and thin and had never developed the sharp finish a good vinegar wanted. 3 batches, 6,600 gallons of pomace processed for nothing. $2,200 in electricity, spoiled culture, and shipping. 3 months. She had begun to keep the notebook in the barn. She wrote down at the end of March every step of the failure, the date, the temperature morning and evening, the pH by day, the visual observations, what Otis had said on the phone and what she had done about it and what she had learned from the doing. The last line she wrote on the last day of March was, "The pomace does not care about my schedule. It has its own." She underlined it once. Wendell Crane drove up on the second Sunday of April. I was not in his truck this time. He was in a red flatbed. She had never seen him drive. In the bed of the flatbed, tied down with orange ratchet straps, was a load of pine shavings, bright, freshly cut, the kind that came off the planer at a working lumberyard and smelled the way that only fresh pine can smell in the second month of spring. He backed the flatbed up to the barn without asking. He got out. He walked to the tailgate. He undid the straps. He began forking the pine shavings down into a small, tidy pile at the edge of the barn's east wall, and he did this for about 6 minutes without looking at Hazel, who had come out onto the porch and was watching him from about 40 feet away. When he was done, he brushed his gloves off. He looked at the pile. He looked at her. "I had extra from a barn build over in Leavenworth. Was gonna burn it." He did not add anything else. He got in the flatbed. He drove off. Hazel walked over to the shavings. She knelt beside them. She took a handful. They were cool and dry, and they smelled clean the way things smell when a person needs them to smell clean. Pine shavings for insulation, she realized, between the fermenters and the barn wall, or wrapped around the barrels, cheap, effective, available. It was a solution she had been trying to figure out how to afford for 2 months. Wendell had not said this. Wendell would never say this. He had simply left the pine shavings. She stood there in the sun with her hand on the pile for a long time. Later that afternoon, she walked out to the mailbox for the mail. There was a bill from the electric company. There was a catalog she did not want, and there was a small square envelope, ivory addressed in a slow, careful hand she recognized immediately. She opened it on the porch. Otis had written on a plain white card, no salutation, no signature, only 4 sentences. "Your grandfather understood something about waiting. Read what he wrote inside his knife's home. He did not tell everyone. He told the people he expected to figure it out." Hazel read it 3 times. She went into the barn. The cigar box was where she had left it the previous June, on the workbench, along the western wall, 3 feet from the leftmost fermenter, its wood darker now from the barn's damp air. She wiped her hands on her jeans. She lifted the lid. She looked inside. The knife was there. The journal was there. Ansel had apparently kept the box lined with a folded piece of oilcloth that fit snug against the sides. She had never lifted the oilcloth. She had never thought to. She lifted it now. The bottom of the box under the oilcloth had nothing in it. She turned the box over slowly. She flipped the lid, and on the inside of the lid, where the printed label had once been, and where the label had been carefully sanded away years ago to leave a bare pine surface, she saw in Ansel's small pencil hand 7 words. A grafting knife does not cut. It teaches 2 things to be one. She set the box down on the workbench. She sat on the low stool by the fermenters. She did not cry. She did not move for a while. Outside the barn, a robin was calling from the Cortlandt row. The fermenters, which she had begun in the 2nd week of March to insulate with straw bales and wool blankets, and the last of her savings, and which she would before summer insulate more properly with Wendell's pine shavings, ticked gently with the sound of steel adjusting to warming air. She read the words on the inside of the lid one more time. Then she stood up. She closed the box. She put it back where it had been, and she walked out into the sun of the yard with her hands in her pockets and her mind for the first time in 3 months entirely clear about what came next. The letter from First Cascade National came on the 14th of October. Hazel had been expecting a letter of some kind for a long time, but not, she found out later, that letter. The bank was calling in Ansel's outstanding equipment loan, $18,000, principal only, no negotiation on the accrued interest, 60 days to remit in full, or the bank would file for a lien against the property. The letter was signed by a woman named Catherine Osgood, VP of Agricultural Lending, whom Hazel had never spoken to and would not later, though she would remember the woman's name for a long time. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. The reason it arrived on a Tuesday, Hazel understood by Friday, was that Wednesday and Thursday had been consumed by 2 other pieces of information that would arrive on schedule after it. She learned on Wednesday morning that Cascade Loop Orchard Tours, where she had worked part-time for 6 years, was reducing her hours from 30 to 8. She was told this by a supervisor who did not meet her eyes and who used the phrase corporate ownership changing 3 times in a 5-minute conversation, and who could not, when asked, name the corporate entity that had recently taken a controlling interest in the tour company. She learned on Thursday afternoon that her application for a USDA small farm microloan had been denied. Did the application in July. It had made it through 2 rounds of review. It had been rejected at the 3rd at the state committee level. She would find out later, without being told directly, that a member of Cascade Fruit Company's board of directors sat on the state committee as an appointed advisor. She sat at the kitchen table on Friday morning with the 3 pieces of paper in front of her: the bank letter, the tour company hours change, the USDA denial, and she did the arithmetic. 18,000 in 60 days. She had 4,200 in savings. She was losing $11,000 a year in tour income. She had in the barn 600 gallons of what would be in another 2 months saleable vinegar, but she did not yet have wholesale buyers. She could not, by any calculation she had done or could do, make the 18,000 in 60 days. She sat with that. That afternoon, Von Merrick's silver expedition came up her drive for the first time in 4 years. He did not get out. He rolled his window down. Hazel came out onto the porch and stopped at the top of the steps. "Miss Ashwood." "Vaughn, I heard First Cascade called your note. That must be a heavy week." She did not answer. "I am not here to make you another offer. Nothing about my last offer has changed. If you decide you want to talk, you know how to reach me. You take care of yourself." He backed the expedition slowly out of the drive. He did not turn around. She stood on the porch a long minute after he was gone. The 3 papers were still on the kitchen table behind her. She had known who put them there. Knowing was one thing. Seeing him arrange his silence at the top of her drive was another. She went back inside. The mushroom substrate attempt began the following week. She had been planning it for 6 months. Otis had suggested it in June that pomace, once pasteurized and mixed with straw, could substrate a small oyster mushroom operation. Mushrooms could pay quickly. A pound of oyster wholesale was $6 retail, closer to 11. She had the barn space. She had the pomace. She had the straw. She had the wisdom hard-won of 2 previous failures. She had not, it turned out, quite understood pasteurization. She had built a pasteurization vessel out of a converted horse trough. She had installed a propane burner. She had heated the substrate to what she believed was the correct temperature, 158 degrees Fahrenheit, and had held it there per Otis's instructions for 90 minutes. She had cooled it. She had inoculated with oyster mushroom spawn she had bought from a supplier in the Willamette Valley for $140. She had known on the 5th day that something was wrong when she opened the first bag and saw not the white cottony mycelium of oyster mushroom, but the pale green fuzz of trichoderma. Trichoderma, she learned later that afternoon from a paper Otis emailed her, would not colonize a substrate that had been pasteurized to 170 degrees Fahrenheit for 90 minutes. It would colonize a substrate that had been pasteurized to only 158, because at that temperature, trichoderma spores survived, while oyster mycelium did not have a large enough head start. She had underheated the substrate by 12 degrees. 60% of the bags failed. Within 10 days, she lost $3,500 in spawn, in bags, in gypsum, in propane, in her own labor. The last bag she opened smelled like a school gymnasium in July. She sat on the barn floor after that last opening. She sat for a long time. It was the 2nd week of November. The barn was cold. The fermenters ticked. Outside, a raven was calling from the Cortlandt row. She thought for the first time since the day the first truck had come that Von Merrick might actually win. She thought that. Then she stood up and she washed her hands and she went into the farmhouse and she started a pot of coffee because there was no other thing to do. The winter that followed was the longest of her life. Aunt Ruth Ann came over almost every Sunday. She brought food. She sat at the kitchen table and read aloud from books. She spoke when she spoke at all, in the low, careful voice a person uses when the person she is speaking to is very close to a breaking point that has not yet been acknowledged. On the 2nd Sunday of February, when a foot of new snow had come down overnight and the roads had not yet been plowed, and the sky was the flat white it gets in the Wenatchee Valley when a system has stalled over the ridge, Aunt Ruth Ann let herself in through the back door and shook the snow off her boots and stood in the kitchen with her coat still on. Hazel looked up from the kitchen table. She had been writing in the spiral notebook. She set the pencil down. Aunt Ruth Ann came to the table and sat down without taking her coat off. She folded her hands in her lap. I want to say something. I want you to hear me all the way through before you say anything back. Hazel waited. Cascade is not going to leave you alone. They are going to grind you down. They have ground down 4 farms in this county in the last 12 years. They are patient the way a river is patient. They do not need to win any given year. They only need to win eventually. Hazel waited. Your grandfather signed the contract for Section 4 in 1998, the winter your grandmother had her surgery, and I know for a fact that he was not reading straight that fall. I know because I read the contract for him 3 months later at his request at this same table, and I told him what he had done. He knew by then. He knew, and he said to me, and I have not forgotten it, that he had done a thing he could not undo, and that he was going to have to teach himself to live inside it. Hazel did not move. You do not have to live inside it, Hazel. Not the way he did. You can sell Section 4 back to Cascade. Only Section 4, 12 acres, keep the orchard, keep the house, take the money and pay off the bank and get out from under the loan. Your grandfather would understand. He would want you to have a chance. He never expected you to fight a war he had already lost. Aunt Ruth Ann stopped. She did not press further. She sat with her hands in her lap, and she looked at her niece across the table in a kitchen whose yellow bulb Hazel had still not changed. Hazel did not answer right away. She stood up. She walked to the sink. She washed a spoon that was already clean. She dried her hands. She turned. She leaned against the counter with her arms folded. Her coat was on the hook by the door. The copper knife was in the pocket of it, where she had put it after she had come in from the barn that morning. I am not going to sell Section 4. Aunt Ruth Ann closed her eyes. Not this year, not next year, not ever, not any part of it. Hazel, Aunt Ruth Ann, I know you love me. I know you are trying to help. I am going to say one more thing, and then I am not going to argue with you tonight. She waited until her aunt opened her eyes again. Grandpa did not lose that war. He handed it to me. I do not know yet how I am going to win it, but I know that if I sell Section 4 to Von Merrick, I am handing it to him, and I am not going to hand it to him. Aunt Ruth Ann looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded one time, small, and she stood up, and she put her scarf back on, and she walked to the door. At the door she stopped. She did not turn around. I am not going to bring it up again, but I want you to know that I said what I said because I love you, not because I do not believe in you. I know. Aunt Ruth Ann let herself out. Hazel stood at the counter for a long time. Then she walked to the kitchen table. She sat down. She opened her spiral notebook. She wrote in careful pencil at the top of a fresh page, "A grafting knife does not cut. It teaches two things to be one." She underlined it twice. She turned the page. She began slowly to write out a plan for how to make $18,000 in 60 days. At the top of the second page, she wrote the words Portland auction. Below that, she wrote fly fishing rods, 5 Old Ashwood 1907. She looked at the words for a long minute. Then she wrote a phone number underneath. It was the number of Aardsma and Company, an auction house on Southeast Grand Avenue in Portland that specialized in antique sporting goods, and which she had researched 6 months earlier in a moment of what she had thought at the time was pointless preparation. She called the number in the morning. She drove to Portland on the following Tuesday with the 5 rods carefully wrapped in old wool blankets in the back of Ansel's Ford pickup. She met a man named Van Aardsma in a small oak-paneled office. She watched him unroll each rod slowly. She watched him bring a small magnifier down over each ferrule and each guide taking his time saying nothing. She watched him lay the 5th rod down on the black velvet cloth beside its 4 brothers. He looked up at her. "These are not for sale." "They are. You do not understand what you have. I understand exactly what I have." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he nodded once and he named a number that was almost exactly what she needed. She came home from Portland with a check in an envelope on the passenger seat and a truck that made a grinding sound when she took the left turn onto Highway 97 in Ellensburg. She did not stop to have the truck looked at. She drove past the exit for the shop where Ansel had taken it in 2016, and she kept going north up the 2-lane through Blewett Pass in early spring rain, past the pull-off where he had once, when she was 11, shown her the way a fresh grafting scion should feel between the thumb and forefinger, and she came down the pass into the Wenatchee Valley at just after 5 in the afternoon with the light going pale gray over the ridge. She deposited the check that Friday at Peshastin Community Bank. She wrote a check to First Cascade National for the full $18,000 the following Monday. She kept a copy of the receipt. She put the copy in an envelope in the top drawer of the kitchen hutch where Ansel had kept the deed to the farm. Catherine Osgood, VP of Agricultural Lending, did not send a reply. Neither did Vaughn Merrick. Hazel did not tell Aunt Ruth Ann about the rods for 11 days. When she did it while making coffee at her aunt's kitchen sink on a Sunday morning, and she said it plainly without prelude, and Aunt Ruth Ann set down the newspaper she was reading and did not look up for a while. When she did, she said only, "He would have wanted you to." "I know. That is not the same as being sorry, Hazel. I know that too." They did not talk about it again that morning. They did not talk about it in any morning that followed, though Hazel would once, 6 months later, catch her aunt running her finger along the empty top of the fishing rod case that still sat in the back of the pantry, and she would say nothing then either. The journal did the rest. She had, in the 10 quiet weeks between the Portland sale and the start of that year's Cascade delivery season, gone back through Ansel's leather-bound book from the very beginning, not for the last 3 pages, not for the section on Section 4, for everything. She had read from 1968 forward. She had read Marta's pregnancy entry in 1979. She had read the maple leaf drawing in 2003. She had read the small unadorned entry in 2011 that said on the 7th of April, gave Otis a jar of the mother. He will do right by it. She had read in a section she had somehow missed on her first 2 passes, a 2-page entry from November 1994, titled in Ansel's own careful hand, "Cold Stabilize." Notes from Ole's method, his grandfather's method. Ansel had written in that entry the way his father Ole had told him. Vinegar had been made in a farmhouse in Bergen before the First War. Slow, cold, the barrels wrapped in wool. The cellar kept just above freezing all winter, then raised gradually 1 degree per day through the first month of spring, so that the Acetobacter came alive as if the seasons were doing its own work for it. Ansel had tried the method once in 1994 on a small 3-gallon test. The results had been unexpectedly good. He had not tried it again because it was, in his phrase, more trouble than the family needed and would want documenting first. I had never documented it. Hazel documented it. She spent 6 weeks that spring converting one of the fermenters, the smallest, the one closest to the wall, into a cold stabilized barrel. She wrapped it in Wendell's pine shavings and in 3 surplus wool army blankets she had bought at a Kashmir thrift store. She insulated the barn wall behind it with 2 layers of foam board she paid for in cash. She installed a small electric heater she could control from a thermostat on the workbench. She stopped trying to hold the fermenter at 68. She let it drop in the last week of March to 41 degrees, and then she raised it 1 degree per day through the whole of April until on the last day of the month the barrel was ticking at 63 and the smell of good vinegar was coming up off the surface for the first time in her 28 years of standing in that barn. She sent a jar of it to Otis by mail. Otis wrote back a week later on another plain white card. She would keep this one too. It said in 4 lines, Ansel would have liked this. The waiting was the whole trick. He knew that. He was, I think, only ever waiting for the person who would keep it going. That is you. That is what he saw. She read the card in the barn on the low stool beside the fermenter. She did not underline anything that day. That was the summer she met Nellie Spear properly. She had been buying pipe fittings and hardware from Spear Hardware and Feed for 18 months, but she had bought them the way a person buys things from a store, quickly, quietly, in and out. Nellie worked the counter 3 days a week. She was 74 that summer, a widow of 20 years, with silver hair she kept short and hands that had spent 43 years lifting things heavier than her arms had wanted to lift. Hazel came in on the 12th of June for a pack of copper connectors and a length of stainless piping. She set the items on the counter. Nellie rang them up. Nellie looked up. "You're Ansel Ashwood's girl, his granddaughter." Nellie set down the pen. "I thought so. You have his hands." Hazel did not know what to say to that. "Marta and I sang in the church choir together for 31 years. You would not remember me. I remember you. You were 4 years old, on your grandmother's lap, in the second row on the left. You had a red bow in your hair." She said this without sentiment. She said it the way a woman states weather. "I know who you are, ma'am." "Nellie, don't call me ma'am. I am too old, and I am too tired to be called ma'am, and I don't like it." "Nellie." Nellie handed her the bag. Their eyes met. Nellie's were a clear, pale gray. "I hear you are making vinegar. I am trying to. Bring me a bottle when you have some. I want to try it. I do not want it as a gift. I want to pay for it. Then if it is any good, I want you to bring me 12 bottles a week, and I will sell them on the front counter, and I will take 15% for handling, and you will keep the rest. I will not sign anything with you, and I do not want you to sign anything with me. Do we understand each other?" Hazel stood at the counter with the bag in her hand. "Yes, ma'am," and then correcting herself, "Nellie." "Yes." Nellie nodded once. She went back to writing on her ledger. Hazel walked out of the store into the June afternoon with the bag of copper connectors in one hand and a feeling in her chest she had not had in 3 years and did not entirely trust, because she was afraid of what would happen if she trusted it, and it turned out to be false. She brought Nellie the bottle 2 weeks later. She brought her 12 bottles the following Monday. By the end of July, Nellie was selling 40 bottles a week off the front counter of Spear Hardware and Feed. By the end of August, she had sold out 3 times and had told Hazel, in her flat, unornamented way, that people were driving in from Wenatchee for it, and that a woman from Leavenworth had come in twice, and that Hazel might want to think about labeling it properly, because there was a chance it was going to move. Hazel labeled it that fall. Ashwood Orchard. The label read in a plain block letter, "Vinegar, cold stabilized, Peshastin, Washington." She did not put her own name on it. She did not put Ansel's name on it. She would explain this later to Otis when he asked her why. She would say she had thought about it a long time and had decided that the name of the orchard was older than either of them and would outlast both of them, and that it seemed to her that a label should say a thing that was true. Otis had nodded when she said that and had not said anything back. She was coming home from Wenatchee on the 16th of October, when the light did the thing it does in the valley in autumn. She had made a delivery that morning, 20 bottles to a small grocery in downtown Wenatchee, whose owner had said she wanted to try carrying it. Hazel had done the drop and left, not staying for coffee, because she was still not entirely comfortable being talked about as a person who had made a thing that others wanted. She drove north on Highway 2 out of Wenatchee in the first hour after lunch. The road climbed slowly through the orchards on the east side of the river. The apples that year had come in heavy. The Cortland row on Cascade's largest, holding 120 acres visible from the highway between Kashmir and Peshastin, was in its last week of picking, and the crews were still working the trees at 3 in the afternoon, their vests fluorescent against the deep green. She passed the sign for the Cascade Fruit Company Wenatchee plant at 3:15. She did not look at it. She passed her own turnoff at 3:32. She did not turn. She kept going, past the Cortland Row, past the wooden bridge over the small tributary that fed into the Wenatchee below, past the pull-off where, when she was 11, Ansel had shown her the way of fresh cyan felt between thumb and forefinger. She drove another 3 miles up the road until she reached the Blewett Pass overlook, which was really only a wide gravel shoulder where the county had put up a picnic table and a sign about a wildfire 50 years earlier. She pulled in. She parked. She got out. The valley below her was already turning. The larches on the far ridge were starting to yellow. The Wenatchee River, a thin silver ribbon, moved slowly through the middle distance. Far to the south, Cascade Fruit's Wenatchee plant looked from that height like a small collection of white boxes stacked in a corner of the world that had been arranged patiently by someone with a plan and time to spare. Hazel stood at the overlook with her hands in the pockets of her chore coat. The copper knife was in her right pocket. She had been carrying it there for 6 months. She had stopped wearing it on her belt in the middle of the summer, when it had begun to strike her as a thing that wanted, in a way she could not quite explain, to be held rather than displayed. She kept it there now the way a person keeps a piece of a person they love. She touched it once. She let go of it. She looked out over the valley. She said quietly out loud to nobody, "A grafting knife does not cut. It teaches 2 things to be one." She said it once. Then she stood there for another minute in the cold, clear afternoon. Then she got back in the truck. She drove home. The year moved past. She hired her first employee in the spring of the following year, and her second in the summer, and by the middle of that summer, she had a small production line running along the east wall of the barn that included 6 new fermenters, a bottle rinser she had bought from a defunct kombucha operation in Bellingham, and a labeler she had assembled from a kit that had arrived in 3 boxes and had taken her a weekend of quiet cursing to figure out. Her first employee was a woman named Marley Vaneskavage, 22, from Kashmir. Marley had grown up on her family's cherry farm and had taken a year off from Wenatchee Valley College. She was quiet, careful, and had on her first afternoon corrected an error in Hazel's inventory spreadsheet with such tact that Hazel had not until 3 days later realized what had happened. Her second employee was Hollis Barnhart, 63, retired mechanic whose wife had died the year before and who did not want to sit in an empty house. Hollis fixed everything that needed fixing. He fixed the pickup's transmission. He fixed the barn door that had been dragging for 2 winters. He fixed the labeler when Hazel had, on the 3rd day of its existence, put the ribbon in backwards. He worked 3 afternoons a week and would not accept more than $11 an hour, and when Hazel had once tried to give him 12, he had refused it with a small, firm shake of his head and had said only, "Don't." Cyrus Merton came in the fall. I was 15 that year. He was the middle son of a family whose land backed up to hers on the south side. His father worked at the Cascade Ellensburg plant. This was a fact none of them talked about. Cyrus had ridden past on his bicycle in the summer since he had been about 11, watching Hazel move fence in the North Strip, and had in the last week of September of that year walked over on foot after school with his hands in the pockets of a plaid coat too big for him, and had asked with the small, careful directness of a boy who had rehearsed the sentence 3 times in his own head whether she needed help. She had asked him what kind of help, anything, for how long, whenever, for how much. He had considered that a moment. "Whatever you want to pay me." She had taken him on the following Tuesday for $8 an hour, 3 afternoons a week. She had raised it quietly to 10 in the spring. He had never asked. She had known she was going to. Otis Colburn drove up from Wenatchee once a month, still in the old white Toyota. He brought scones now. His wife had died in the winter of that year, and after her funeral he had begun baking, and the scones had begun arriving with him in a small paper bag on the front seat, and Hazel had eaten a scone at her kitchen table with him every 4th Sunday for the better part of 18 months. He never explained the scones. She never asked. Nellie Spear's store sold 200 bottles a week by the end of that summer. A small grocery in downtown Ellensburg picked up a wholesale account in October. A restaurant in Leavenworth followed in November. By the following spring, Hazel had accounts in 7 independent stores across 3 counties, and she was, without having noticed the moment when it had happened, no longer selling all her production. She had inventory now. The trucks still came. Tuesday, Wednesday, some Fridays. Cascade did not slow. Cascade did not, so far as Hazel could tell from the shoulder of Highway 2, in any way modify its operations to reflect that a small orchard at the end of a gravel road was quietly and steadily converting its rejected apple mash into something the county liked to buy. Vaughn Merrick had not been by in 3 years. He had raised his written offer once more in the 2nd November of that stretch to $440,000. Hazel had filed the letter without a reply in a manila folder in the top drawer of the hutch, where she kept the receipts from First Cascade National and the deposit slip from the Portland auction. C began that spring to keep 2 folders in the hutch. One was labeled Cascade. One was labeled Ashwood. The Cascade folder held Vaughn's letters. It held Catherine Osgood's letters. It held a copy of the loan payoff. It held the small handful of legal notices she had received over 3 years from lawyers she did not know on Cascade letterhead on subjects that had come to nothing. The Ashwood folder held everything else. Hazel would not, when she thought about it later, remember exactly the month or the year that she had realized the Ashwood folder had become the thicker of the 2. She only remembered that it happened. It had happened around the time Cyrus began coming 3 days a week instead of 2. It had happened around the time Aunt Ruth Ann stopped bringing food that Hazel did not eat. She was awarded in April of the 7th year a small recognition from the Washington Small Farm Alliance. She was invited to Olympia for a ceremony. She sent Aunt Ruth Ann instead. Ruth Ann came home with a wooden plaque and a story about a director named Delia Marchetti, who had at the reception said something Ruth Ann had thought Hazel might want to hear. She said your granddad wrote her a letter once, in 2016, she still has it. About what? About soil, about what people call waste. She said she thought about that letter a lot. Hazel took the plaque. She did not hang it. She put it in the top of the hutch behind the Ashwood folder. She did not at that point know quite what to do with being recognized. She had not in 7 years been building the operation because she wanted it recognized. She had been building it because Vaughn Merrick had told her once on a Tuesday in April in her own drive that a young woman on her own could not carry a place like this, and because her grandfather, who could no longer speak for himself, had left her 3 pages in a leather-bound book. 2 things she thought sometimes do not need everyone to know they have been taught to be one. One of them needs to know it. That is enough. Vaughn Merrick came back in the 3rd week of May. He came with a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Preston Wickham. He was a partner at a firm in Yakima. He wore a charcoal suit, and he drove a black Audi sedan, and he carried a leather portfolio the color of an old saddle. He arrived following Vaughn's Silver Ford expedition at 11:30 on a Thursday morning that had begun when Hazel had opened her eyes at 5 that day as an ordinary morning. She saw them from the barn. She was going through the fermenter log with Marley. Marley had, over the course of the previous year, taken over the daily probe readings and had also, at Hazel's request, begun keeping a duplicate copy of the log on her own laptop at home. Hazel had not explained why. Marley had not asked. When the 2 vehicles pulled through the gate and stopped at the drive, Marley looked up once at Hazel and then closed the log and stood up. "Do you want me to stay?" "No." "Do you want me to go?" "I want you to be here, but not in the room." Marley nodded and went to the far corner of the barn where the pallets were stacked and began quietly doing nothing. Hazel walked out to the drive. Vaughn stepped out of the expedition first. He had aged in 3 years. His hair was more silver. He was thinner through the shoulders. The smile he offered was the same smile, and the barn coat over the shirt was the same coat, though the shirt underneath looked new. "Miss Ashwood." "Vaughn, I want to introduce you to Preston Wickham. He's counsel for Cascade Fruit Company in matters like this." "What matters?" Preston did not answer that. He stepped forward and offered his hand. She did not take it. He set it back at his side without any visible reaction and reached into his portfolio and withdrew a folded sheet of paper. "Miss Ashwood," Preston said. His voice was quiet, careful, rehearsed but not unpleasantly so. "This is a formal cease and desist letter concerning your production and sale of a product marketed as apple cider vinegar under the label Ashwood Orchard. It is Cascade Fruit Company's position that your production is in violation of the exclusive supply agreement executed by your grandfather Ansel Ashwood in October of 1998, which grants Cascade exclusive rights to any downstream commercial product derived from apple mass-produced on this property." I held the letter out. She did not take it. "That contract," she said, "covers waste disposal on Section 4, not products made on the rest of the property. Our reading is broader. Your reading is wrong." Preston's expression did not change. Vaughn's mouth tightened just slightly at one corner. "We would very much like to resolve this quietly," Preston said. "Cascade is prepared to file for injunctive relief and pursue damages for tortious interference, but we would prefer a settlement. If you will step inside with us, I have an outline of terms." Hazel looked at Vaughn. She had not until that moment understood what she was looking at. She had for 7 years been looking at a man. Now she saw that she had also for 7 years been looking at a machine. The machine did not want the vinegar. The machine did not want the ACV brand or the small storefront accounts or the Washington Small Farm Alliance plaque in her hutch. The machine wanted the land. It had wanted the land for 25 years. It would want the land in another 25 if she let it. Everything else was cost of acquisition. All right, she said. She turned. She walked toward the farmhouse. They followed. She let them in through the porch door. She did not ask them to sit. She did not offer them coffee. Preston set his portfolio on the kitchen table, and Vaughn stood by the doorway with his hands in the pockets of his barn coat, and Hazel opened the top drawer of the hutch. She took out the Ashwood folder. She set it on the table beside Preston's portfolio. She took a smaller stack of items from a lower drawer, the leather-bound journal, a red spiral notebook that had at that point 5 years of entries in it, a flash drive on a small blue lanyard. She set all of them on the table too. Preston looked at them. He looked at her. "What is this?" "This," Hazel said, "is what my grandfather started documenting on the 11th of April in 2015 when he took the first of 16 soil samples from Section 4 and sent them to WSU, and what I have been documenting on my own in this notebook since the 15th of April in the year I inherited the property, and what is backed up on that flash drive with photographs by date." She opened the journal. She turned to the last 3 pages. She turned the journal so Preston could read it. She stepped back from the table. She did not sit. Preston looked at Vaughn. Vaughn's face did not this time entirely stay where it had been. His eyes moved to the journal on the table and back to Hazel, and then to the red spiral notebook beside it, and then to the flash drive, and then finally to a place somewhere over Hazel's left shoulder where nothing in particular was, and he held that gaze for about 8 seconds without blinking, and when he brought it back into the room, his mouth had settled itself into a shape Hazel had not seen on it before. It was not surprise. Surprise would have been quicker. It was closer to the expression of a man who has in the middle of a familiar street taken a wrong turn and only now realized where the street had actually been going. Preston sat down. He read for a long time. He read the 16 entries. He read the photocopies of Cascade's WSDA disposal permits, which Hazel had in her second year on the farm driven to the county office in Wenatchee to obtain, and which Ansel had annotated in pencil in his own hand, noting in the margins that pomace was not among the permitted materials. He read Ansel's unfinished draft letter to the director of the Solid Waste Management Program, Washington Department of Ecology, Central Region Office in Yakima, dated May of 2019, unsigned, ending mid-sentence, in the pencil hand of a man who did not in the end get to finish. Then Preston opened Hazel's red notebook. He read 5 years of entries. He read the truck IDs. He read the tonnages. He read the dates. He read the times to the minute. He read her notes on the color of the pomace on the ground during warm weeks. He read her notes on the smell. He read her notes on the small brown ring that had appeared in the leaves of the Cortland row nearest the west edge of Section 4 in June of her 3rd year. He read the last entry. It was dated the previous Tuesday. It read, Truck 4197, 9:14 a.m., 6.4 tons. Weather overcast, 62F. Same driver as last 2 weeks. Section 4 pile now measurably smaller than last September because processing is finally exceeding intake. He closed the notebook. He set it down. He plugged the flash drive into a small laptop he had taken from his portfolio. He looked through the photographs. He looked through them for a long time. Hazel could see the screen from where she stood. Aunt Ruth Ann had backed up 2,311 photographs by date, GPS tagged when possible, cataloged by truck arrival. Preston closed the laptop. He looked up. He looked at Vaughn. "Vaughn," he said. His voice had gone very quiet. "We need to talk outside." Vaughn's expression this time did move. Not much. Only a small drop at the corner of the mouth. Only a small tightening in the small muscles at the temples. Then he nodded once and he opened the porch door and they walked out. They stood in the yard for 22 minutes. They did not raise their voices. Hazel watched them from the kitchen window while she washed a coffee cup she had already washed. She watched Preston gesture calmly with his hands. She watched Vaughn stand very still. She watched at the end of the 22 minutes Preston walk back to the porch alone. He did not come inside. He said, through the screen door, "We will not be pursuing the matter, Miss Ashwood. I will retract the letter in writing by end of business tomorrow. I would ask in return that the materials on your table remain private for the time being." She looked at him a long moment. "They will remain what they are. That is all I will promise." Preston nodded. He picked up his portfolio. He walked to the black Audi. He drove away. Vaughn did not come back to the porch. He got into the Expedition. He sat there for a moment with the door open, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on his knee, and he looked out at the orchard past the fence line, and then he closed the door and drove away, and the sound of his tires on the gravel was the last sound Hazel would ever hear him make on her property. The Cascade truck came the following Tuesday. It came at 9:17, as it had come at 9:17 on almost every Tuesday for 7 years, and it dumped 6 tons of palmace on Section 4 as it had done for 7 years. The driver was the same driver. He raised his cap. He said, "Miss Ashwood." He drove out. The letter from Preston Wickham arrived on Thursday, retracting the cease and desist as promised. The phone call came 3 weeks later. It came from a man named David Colfax, whose title was Vice President for Regional Strategy at Cascade Fruit Company, and who was not so far as Hazel had ever known the person she had spoken to before. He introduced himself politely. He said Vaughn Merrick had been transferred to Cascade's Idaho operations. He said Cascade had, upon internal review, determined that certain historical practices in the central Washington region required updating. He said Cascade was interested in exploring a mutually beneficial commercial relationship with Ashwood Orchard. He named a wholesale price for her vinegar that was 20% above her current highest account. He named an annual purchase volume that would, if she accepted it, consume approximately 80% of her current production. He named a 5-year term with automatic renewal with an exclusivity clause preventing her from selling comparable products to any other buyer during the term of the agreement. He said he would very much like to send a contract for her review. Hazel listened. When he was finished, she said, "I appreciate the call, Mr. Colfax. David, I appreciate the call, but I don't sign exclusives." There was a small pause on the line. "Miss Ashwood, the price we are offering, I understand the price. Then may I ask?" "You may." She waited. He asked. She answered him plainly, and she was surprised to hear how plainly it came out. "When I bought 180 gallons of stainless steel for $180 apiece from a defunct dairy in Wenatchee 3 years ago, I did it because a big processor had put that dairy out of business without ever meeting them. I am not going to do the same thing to Nellie Spear and to the woman in downtown Wenatchee who ordered a case a week last November because her granddaughter wanted to help her carry it, and to the restaurant in Leavenworth that pays me 30 days late every third month because she still runs the place herself. If I sign a 5-year exclusive with Cascade, I own a business on paper, and you own what it does. In 5 years, when it is convenient, you will tell me the volume is going down and the price is dropping, and my other customers will be gone. I have already lived that story. I am not going to live it again. There was a longer pause on the line. David Colfax cleared his throat. I understand. May I ask then whether Cascade might be able to purchase your vinegar without an exclusivity clause at a lower volume? Of course, I sell to anyone who pays. I can offer you a wholesale rate that would be competitive with what you are paying other suppliers. There would be no minimums and no maximums and no term. You can order what you want when you want it. That is very much the arrangement Cascade would prefer to avoid. I understand. I will bring it to my colleagues. Please do. He hung up. She did not hear from him again for a month. When she did hear back, it was in a short professional email that thanked her for her time and confirmed that Cascade would not, at the current time, be moving forward with a commercial relationship. The email did not mention Vaughn Merrick. It did not mention the events of May. It said only that Cascade had appreciated the discussion and wished her continued success. She saved the email in the Cascade folder. She saved a printed copy behind it. Wendell Crane arrived on the 17th of August. He arrived on foot. He came up the gravel road from his own driveway with a spiral notebook in his hand. Same red cardboard cover as hers. Cheap. She saw him from the porch. She was drinking a cup of coffee in the middle of the afternoon, and Marley had already left for the day, and Hollis was on his 3-day vacation for his brother's birthday, and Cyrus was still at school. Hazel had been sitting alone on the porch step reading the sports pages of the Wenatchee World, and when she looked up, Wendell was already halfway down her drive. She set the paper down. She stood up. He stopped about 6 feet from her. He held the notebook against his hip, the way she had learned from him that a man holds a document he has thought carefully about. Wendell, Hazel. They looked at each other for a moment. She had not in 7 years heard him say her first name. I've got some ground on the back of my place. It stopped growing anything that could feed a cow about 8 years ago. My son wants me to sell it to Cascade. Cascade offered on it last summer. I have not answered them. She waited. I was hoping you would show me what you did, if you have the time. She did not answer right away. She stepped down off the porch. She walked past him about 10 feet. She stopped. She turned. Wendell, yes, I need to know something first. All right. Vaughn Merrick came out to your place in the 2nd year, didn't he? Wendell held her eyes for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, slowly. Vaughn Merrick came to my place in the fall of your 2nd year. He sat in my kitchen for an hour. He asked me what I thought would happen to you. I told him I did not think you would keep the place. I told him because I meant it. He asked me if I would say so if he asked me again in front of other men. I told him I would. He did ask me, and I did. Hazel did not speak. Wendell did not look away. I have thought about that answer more than once since. I am not going to explain what I thought. I do not think it is owed. But I want you to know I said it, and I want you to know I know what he did with it, and that I have been driving past your fence line for 7 years without stopping, because I did not know how to look at you without saying it, and because I could not at first bring myself to say it, and because it took me a while to understand that not saying it was worse than saying it. He paused. That is all I am going to say about that. She looked at him. She looked at his hands. His hands were cracked at the knuckles. His right thumb was bent slightly from a wire that had let go in 1991. He held the notebook against his hip and waited. She did not standing there know what to do with the sentence her grandfather had said to her once when she was 9. She only knew that she had heard it more than once from Ansel in different rooms, in different weathers, in different circumstances, and that she had heard Ansel say it the year he had done a hard thing. She stepped forward. She held out her hand. Wendell took it. His grip was dry, firm, careful. She said, "Come out to Section 4. She walked. He followed. They walked out past the barn, past the fermenters, visible through the open door in the yellow interior light, past the pallets of bottles Marley had labeled that morning, past the smell of clean vinegar rising off the aging barrels, past the low compost windrows, along the north fence, and out to Section 4. The pile at the west end was smaller than it had been the previous year. It was smaller than it had been in 5 years. Cascade was still bringing 40 tons a week. Hazel was now processing more than that between vinegar, mushroom, substrate, biochar, and finished compost. The pile was at long last shrinking. She showed Wendell the north strip. She showed him the first grafted rootstocks, 2 years planted, chest high, some of them, with tight small buds along the second-year wood. She showed him where the compost went in. She showed him the ratio she used now, 28:1, straw broken to 3-inch lengths, not longer, water to 52% moisture, pile height 4 feet, not 6, turn every 4 days for the first 3 weeks, then every 7, then every 14. She talked for about 40 minutes. Wendell wrote in his notebook the whole time. He did not interrupt. He asked one question near the end, which was how she measured moisture without a probe, and she told him about the fist test, and he wrote that down too. When she was finished, he closed the notebook. He tapped his cap, the small distance that farmers tap caps for private things. Well, he walked back up the gravel road toward his own place. She stood at the edge of Section 4 in the August afternoon, and she watched him go until she could no longer see him past the bend at Merton's property line. Then she walked back to the porch. October came in cool that year. The larches on the ridge began to turn in the first week. By the second week, they were gold. By the third week, they had started to shed, and the small yellow needles came down onto the gravel of Hazel's drive and stuck there in the damp mornings before the sun rose over the ridge and dried them off. Cyrus was 17 that fall. He had graduated in June, and he had come to work full-time on the 1st of July. Hazel had raised him to $16 an hour and had, at Cyrus's own quiet request, held back from that a small percentage each pay period for a savings account she had helped him open at Peshastin Community Bank. He was already talking about taking a 2-year applied horticulture course at Wenatchee Valley College in the fall of the following year. He had not decided yet. They worked together most days now. I handled the labeling line in the mornings and did the fermenter probe checks with Marley in the afternoons. He asked good questions. He did not ask them right away. He would think about a thing for 2 or 3 days, and then over lunch, or while walking to the barn from the truck, or while running the labeler and watching the bottles pass under his hands, he would look up and ask. His questions were mostly, though not entirely, about grafting. I had asked her 3 months earlier whether he could try grafting on a spare rootstock in the back of the barn. She had watched him do the first one. He had done it fine. He had not asked her to watch the second or the third, and by August he had 6 young grafts of his own on rootstocks along the east fence line that Hazel walked past without commenting on, because Cyrus had asked her not to, not out loud. He had asked her by not showing them to her. She had known how to read that. On the second Tuesday of October, she asked him if he wanted to graft the last row of the north strip with her. He said yes. The north strip was that fall in its 3rd year of orchard. Section 4 was now mostly orchard, 4 acres of it, wine sap, Cortland, northern spy, 2 rows of Honeycrisp along the west edge, because Otis had suggested the market would want them. Ansel's heirloom varieties had been grafted from scions Hazel had cut from the original north row of the 60 acres. Cyrus knew the varieties by feel now. He had learned them from her the way she had learned them from Ansel. They went out to Section 4 at 3 in the afternoon. It was warm for October, 62 degrees, no wind. The light was the low honey light of autumn in the valley. Aunt Ruth Ann was at the farmhouse porch with a coffee cup. She had come over that morning, as she did most Tuesdays now, to help Marley with the office paperwork. She had said when Hazel had told her at lunch what she and Cyrus were doing that afternoon, that she would stay on the porch and watch. She sat on the porch step with her coffee. Hazel and Cyrus walked out past the barn. Hazel had the copper knife on her belt. She had taken it out of her pocket that morning. Cyrus had a folding grafting knife of his own that he had bought second-hand from a supplier in Yakima, and which had a green plastic handle worn smooth at the finger grip. They worked the last 12 rootstocks together. I did the cutting. She did the wrapping. He worked slowly. He was careful about the angle. He drew the blade of his knife across the rootstock at a shallow slope, one clean pass, no sawing the wood pale, and wet at the cut, the smell coming up green and slightly bitter into the cool October air. He matched each scion the same way. He set each scion into each cleft with the small, quiet focus of a boy who had, without ever quite noticing when it had happened, become good at something. She wrapped each graft in the black grafting tape, 3 turns tight thumb against the join, and she felt through her thumb the small, firm pressure of one thing being asked to become part of another. Then they moved to the next rootstock, then the next. When they had done the last one, he wiped his knife on his jeans and folded it and slid it into his back pocket. He stood up. He looked at the row. How long? Longer than you think. He laughed. It was a small, dry laugh. That's the whole trick. That is what he told me. They stood there for a moment. Cyrus asked without looking at her, "What are you going to do next?" She did not answer for a moment. She had been thinking about it for a year. She had been thinking about it in small conversations with Otis on Sundays, and in long conversations with Nellie Spear at the counter of the hardware store on Wednesdays, and in the quiet, unspoken conversations she had with the notebook when she wrote in it in the evenings. There are 5 other small orchards in the valley, none of them big, none of them healthy, all of them getting pressed by Cascade or by somebody like Cascade. They have all called me at least once in the last year. They want to know if I can process their pomace. I have been telling them I don't have the capacity. That is not going to be true forever. Cyrus waited. I want to build a cooperative, not a company. A cooperative. 6 farms, shared processing infrastructure. Nobody owns more than 1 seat on the board. We split the costs and we split the revenue, and no farm ever loses its own land to the co-op. If Ashwood Orchard goes under the co-op, keeps running for the other 5. If any of the other 5 goes under the co-op, keeps running for the 4. I do not want to build something that can be bought. That's a lot of work. It is. He looked at her. I would like to help. She looked back at him. I know. They walked out of Section 4 in the slanted honey light. Aunt Ruth Ann stood up from the porch when she saw them coming. She did not wave. She only stood. She had been Marta's sister, and she was, so far as Hazel now understood, after 7 years, the closest thing to a witness her grandfather's line still had. That was not nothing. She raised her coffee cup at Hazel across the yard. Hazel raised her hand. They kept walking. At the porch, Aunt Ruth Ann said, How did they take? Good. You did the last one. Cyrus did. Aunt Ruth Ann looked at Cyrus. Well, she said, that is fine. Cyrus flushed a little. He said, Thanks, ma'am. He went to the pump at the corner of the porch to wash his hands. Hazel stood on the porch a moment beside her aunt. Aunt Ruth Ann looked out at Section 4. He would be sitting on this porch beside me, if he could see it. Hazel did not answer. I would not have known what to say, but he would be sitting here. I know. They stood there for a while. Then Aunt Ruth Ann set her coffee cup down on the railing, and she said she was going in to start supper, and she went inside, and the screen door closed softly behind her. Hazel stayed on the porch. She took the leather-bound journal out of her coat pocket. She had been carrying it there for 7 years. She set it on the top rail of the porch. She took the copper knife off her belt. She set the knife on top of the journal. She looked at them. Cyrus came around from the pump, wiping his hands on the back of his jeans. Cyrus, yes, ma'am, I want you to have these. He looked at the journal and the knife. He looked at her. He did not at first understand. They aren't mine to keep. They weren't ever going to be mine to keep. He gave them to me because there wasn't anyone else. Now there's you. Take them home tonight. Read what he wrote. Then bring them back tomorrow and put them on the workbench in the barn where the fermenters can see them. That is where they should sit from now on. Cyrus did not move for a moment. Then he stepped up onto the porch. He picked up the journal in both hands, the way a child picks up a bird. He set the copper knife on top of it. He held both of them against his chest. He said quietly, Yes, ma'am. She looked at him. She said, A grafting knife does not cut. It teaches 2 things to be one. He nodded once. He went inside to help Aunt Ruth Ann with supper. Hazel stayed on the porch until the sun was gone. The valley cooled quickly in October. She could feel it come down off the ridge the way it always did, a slow settling of the air that started at the top of the north row and moved through the orchard toward the porch in a wave a person could not see but could feel against the skin of the neck. The first fir on the ridge went black against the sky, then the second, then the whole line. She could hear inside the house Aunt Ruth Ann opening the oven. She could hear Cyrus setting 3 plates on the kitchen table. She could hear the small, careful sound of the journal being set down flat on the pine boards. She did not go inside yet. She thought about Ansel. She thought about him kneeling in the wine-sap row with the hat rolling down the wet grass. She thought about him at the kitchen table in 1998 with the contract in front of him and Marta upstairs. She thought about him writing 16 soil samples across 4.5 years and then dying 3 weeks before the 17th. She thought about him keeping the knife his grandfather had brought over from Bergen in a cigar box with an oilcloth in it, and about him writing 7 words on the inside of the lid where nobody could see them unless they knew to look. She thought about the woman on the porch of the farmhouse 7 years earlier who had stood in the yard while 8 tons of brown mash slid into Section 4 and who had not, at that time, known what a windrow was. She thought about the woman who was standing on the porch now. She could not in the last light entirely say which of them she was. She thought standing there that her grandfather had done a thing she would not herself know how to do. He had taken 16 soil samples over 4.5 years, knowing he would not be the one to finish. He had drafted a letter to the Department of Ecology, knowing he would not sign it. He had written 7 words on the inside of a cigar box lid, knowing that whoever he handed the knife to would either understand them in time or would not, and that this was not in the end a thing he could control. I had done it anyway. I had done it because a person who plants a rootstock does not in the strict sense ever expect to eat the fruit. A person who plants a rootstock plants it for someone whose face they will not see, whose name they will not know, whose kitchen table they will not sit at. The grafting knife is only a tool. The tool is only a hand. The hand is only a person. The person is only in the end a link in a line that has been going on since before anybody thought to write it down. She stayed on the porch a long time. The temperature dropped. She put her hands in her coat pockets. She thought briefly of the copper knife she had carried in her right pocket for 7 years, and that was now, this afternoon, in the hands of a 17-year-old boy who had learned to graft from a woman who had learned to graft from a man who had learned it from a Norwegian who had crossed an ocean with a knife in a canvas bag in 1907. She thought about what the boy would carry. She thought about what he would hand down. Up on Highway 2, faintly, she heard the sound of a diesel truck. It came slowly along the highway. It passed the mouth of her gravel road. It did not turn in. It kept going. Cascade had rerouted their palmace after Vaughn had left to a facility over in Quincy. The truck still went by. They no longer stopped. The truck grew fainter. She listened to it fade past Wendell Crane's fence. She said it quietly once more, out loud to no one into the cold, clear October air over Peshastin, Washington. A grafting knife does not cut. It teaches 2 things to be one. She went inside.